Is dance just poetry in motion? How does poetry inspire dance? Does the dancer in the dance inspire poetry? How do the twain flow into each other? A fascinating panel discussion led by Akila Krishnamurthy from Alap, seasoned Bharatanatyam artist Apurva Jayaram from Chennai, Navya Natarajan from Navya Dance Academy, USA, and Purva Dhanashree from Hyderabad, who's reviving Vilasini Natyam. Welcome you to a very inspired session.
Everyone. I'm going to start off actually straight with an excerpt from a really beautiful poem by W.B. Yeats. It's called A Crazed Girl. That crazed girl improvising her music, her poetry dancing upon the shore, her soul in division from itself, climbing, falling she knew not where, hiding amid the cargo of a steamship, her kneecap broken. That girl, I declare, a beautiful, lofty thing, or a thing heroically lost, heroically found. So in Yeats's A Crazed Girl, the speaker is really enthralled by a young woman who finds relief from her harsh existence in singing. Now, despite the poem's rather sense of bleakness, the greatest takeaway from it is perhaps how uplifting this girl's triumph is over her situation, finding succor in her music, poetry in her everyday. When the Bangalore Poetry Festival really reached out to me to curate a panel with dancers and to sort of set it against the backdrop of poetry, I really thought about how in many ways dance and poetry are so inextricably linked with each other. That how dance can itself be poetry and how it's possible to really find poetry in the dance. This session really features solo Bharatanatyam and Vilasini Natyam artists who work in the quiet, sometimes lonely sort of space of their studios and homes and really respond to poetry, but also seek to create poetry in their dance. Now, in my research leading up to this session, I also chanced upon a blog where I read about how the famous philosopher Nietzsche, I hope I got that pronunciation right, was an atheist, but who insisted that he would believe only in a God that knows how to dance. Nietzsche danced daily, saying it was his only kind of piety, his divine service. So I'm going to start off right away by, if we could set the premise of what the focus of our conversation is really by Apurva, since you're right here, is in the context of dance, Apurva, do you think of poetry as literal, as words, meanings, metaphors, or is it really an abstract? What is the first thing that comes to your mind?
Thanks, Akila. First of all, I just want to say it's such a pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you to the Bangalore Poetry Festival for having us all here. I think if I were to look at it as a portraying of a poem through dance, Akila, I think it's all of it at the same time. It is literal, it's about the words, it's about the meaning, it's about the metaphor, and really the sum, the effect that the sum creates. But I think somewhere very fundamentally, the relationship of dance with poetry is one of abstraction. That's what I think.
Yeah.
I do not think of us as dancers as translators. I do think that dance is a very specific, a very technical way of actually reading poetry, which allows you to sort of open a door to it, right, which is very different and give you a certain experience of the poem very different from otherwise that you have from reading it.
Right.
So I think from that point of view, it is always abstract to me because it's about seeing previously unseen dimensions within the poem.
Right.
So I think to me, it is abstract.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting you use the word translators. Navya, I'd like to hear your thoughts. She talked about how dancers are not really translators. So what are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, we aren't translators because it's not about translating a poem. It's about actually getting into the depth and the essence of that poem and bringing it out. It's not scratching the surface. So for me, when I look at poem, it's actually a beautiful marriage of the literal and the abstract. They're intertwined in a way because the literal actually points you in the direction of the abstract. So if you're going to read something, in those pauses, in that silence is where you will actually observe and experience the abstract. Because abstract has this very intangible, quality about it, and it's like a mystery. It's a very slow unveiling of what is there. And I think the literal, what happens is the metaphors and what was there, it kind of helps you concretize that abstract. Because like she said, if I have to move along with the poem, then I need to show the way I can articulate that to my audience. So I need the literal, it concretizes the
It's like an
abstract.
anchor, right?
It's an anchor.
Yeah.
And then the journey is beautiful after that. So for
Right.
me, it's both the literal and the abstract. It's like an aha moment when I chance upon that abstract.
Right.
Yeah.
But that's also a process, right? I mean, it doesn't happen overnight. So what you first see is the literal, and then you deep dive and you engage with it over time, and then you sort of find the abstract, perhaps, right? Apurva, last night over dinner, we were talking about, how you were raised by parents who were, deeply involved in the arts and literature. And you talked to me about how you were, you lived in the realm of poetry and the realm of literature, and it took you a while to always return to the real world, It'd be nice to sort of hear your story in that sense, how you sort of inhabited this world of poetry and how you had to return to the real world.
When you have Kuberdutt and Kabalini Dutt talking poetry 24/7, it definitely, from a child's point of view, needs a conscious effort to define reality. And plus music, plus movements, plus painting, because both of them did not just stop with the word. My mother, a student of Sikil Ramaswamy, a Bharatanatyam dancer, she, because met with an accident, could not dance in body. She was all the time dancing in her mind. She was all the time dancing through the lens because she was in Doordarshan.
Right.
My father, who actually was a poet, but he was all the time dancing with images, dancing in anger, because he was very critical of the way the society was turning into. So for me, it was a very, it came this process of looking for meanings and metaphors and similes all the time. And it did affect my growth as a child, because I had to define my reality in a very, very concrete manner. It helped in dance, definitely, because the poems was talking to me all the time. But I think as a dancer, we also sometimes need to isolate from this whole process of looking at the word through silence as well. And when I became conscious of that, there was a point I said, no, let me see for what life is, and not keep finding meanings in it. And then this thing of taking things as it is actually empowered the process of revisiting a poem or going back to the poetry. And then the silence and the nothingness of life sometimes takes you back to poetry, which comes up with a rebirth. So for me, I had to consciously tell myself that poem is not just the word, find the music behind the word, find the rhythm behind the word, because we were also dealing with not just the word, but melody, but rhythm. So to find the unsaid rhythm in the poem, to find the undefined melody in the poem, that became a conscious process after I worked on myself. That it's not, if you see a leaf falling, it's okay, it's just a leaf falling. Don't keep finding life falling, akashat patitam toyam. Don't start connecting Shankara to this. And so I had to
consciously.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Purva, you talked about dancing in the mind. Your mother couldn't dance, so she was constantly dancing in the mind. I just want to ask everyone really about what is this process of dancing in the mind? Does it happen? Is it a constant every day, or is it, when you start engaging with a particular, piece of work, it's sort of you start engaging with it that you have to make it your own, right? So how do you make it your own? So even while you're outside of the studio, is it constantly playing in your head, or is it like when you step into the studio, you sort of inhabit the poem and then you're out? So how does that happen for you?
I think it's like, the same thing we do when we read a book, right?
Right.
It's like a movie, a visual that's pretty much running in your mind. I think for me, it's not just about when I'm engaged with a poem or creating a new work, but it's just having evolved with dance and a certain training and a certain way of looking at poems. I think it's something that happens quite often. It's not the words, but it's the world that those words evoke for you. So like quite often I find, even if I'm listening to like an old Hindi film song, it's actually playing out like a padam in my head.
Right.
And it's not a conscious effort. You know,
Right.
it's not something that you're intending to, I'm
Yeah.
going to convert this into dance
Right.
at all. But it becomes a way in which you sort of visualize. And I think it's also a very, very beautiful space. You know, just like how when a movie is sort of made of a book, right? It's not a one-to-one translation. You're not taking the story or the idea or the message and, you know, delivering it as a certain visual. I think that's a very exciting thing for me. The fact that you, as a dancer, you are actually creating, painting, inhabiting a world that is evoked by those words.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think, and you further go on to, in your own way as a dancer, navigate that world that you
Yeah.
have now created, I think in a way that only a dancer can do. And that's a very exciting space to
Yeah.
be in. So yeah.
Fantastic. Apurva, you mentioned the idea of, training. You know, I want to ask you really about, Navya, perhaps you could respond to this, about really the process of engaging with a poem, or the process of poetry in dance itself, like the very premise of sadhana or the rigor in dance. Is that also a poem in itself, in a way that it becomes a discipline? You internalize that process, then you make it your own, but it also has to allow room for improvisation. So could you talk a little bit about poetry and its relationship with sadhana and rigor?
Yes. Actually, it's quite it can go into pages, because as artists, we literally live those moments.
Right.
And what we seek is to actually get under the skin of the character who's been spoken about in the poem, or about nature perhaps. So it's about understanding to the depth of it. What is it? Who is it? Why are they saying this? And then, see, there are moments when perhaps it's not even the poem. So perhaps you're just in your studio and you're dancing out a normal routine. We have sadhana. And many a times I have caught myself doing this and feeling this, where, you know, we move from one point to another. Movements have a start and an end. So for example, if I start here and I end there, there is a trajectory that is there of the movement from here to there. And that's where I feel you find poetry. Because there's a lot of energy in it, there's a lot of grace, and it is not an unmindful way of dancing.
But it's changing every day, right?
As in,
What you do this, it change tomorrow,
and
right?
it changes. More than change, I would say it transforms.
Evolving, yeah.
It evolves.
Yeah.
Because as an artist, you go through life, you're just not an artist. You have your personal issues as well.
Yeah.
So sometimes that kind of shades what you're doing. It kind of shades the kind of poems that you select, the way you want to interpret those poems, and the way you want to articulate that to your audience. So because as an artist, let's be very frank, when you're on stage, your vulnerable self. You're actually inviting them into your space. Of course, vulnerability is a strength for an artist.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when you're inviting them, unless you are enjoying that moment, unless you are actually feeling the poetry unfold, there's no way you can have them experience what you are experiencing. So for me, poetry, if I find it in my sadhana, not that every day I'm inspired. There are days when I just drag my leg to the studio and say, Navya, just dance. But there are days when you just start dancing and you're like, okay, my body is moving a particular way, I'm emoting a particular way. There is a relationship between my hand and my body. It's basically aligning to that moment. So for me, that's poetry. That's when poetry unfolds.
Right. Purva, I'm curious to hear about your, does it ever get lonely, frustrating? I was driving, from the airport with a poet, and I was asking him, like, he's also working on a novel, he told me, and I was asking about the difference between engaging with writing a poem versus writing a novel, and how they're two different experiences. But I want to ask you, and he said poetry is something that comes, it's more like occurs, right? Versus something that, whereas with a novel, it's more about rigor. So I want to ask you really, like, does it get lonely to sort of, go into your studio to, like, create work or even do your sadhana? Are there moments of frustration in this process?
In this process, no. I think it's very gratifying. It fills me with a lot of energy and sense of bhakti towards life. My teachers, my parents, everybody who invests in this whole endeavor called art. It gets lonely when I try to explain that process to somebody and then the person doesn't understand. So, and I used to do that because not initially, we look for certain kind of dialoguing, and we also want affirmation from the other, and we want appreciation from the other. And when you're not able to get that, you're like, why can't you understand? These are just gestures. I'm talking your language. Still, why? Then I told myself, it's okay. It's okay to just give. Surrender to the process. Surrender to the poem. If there is a seed in the audience, they will connect to you. Maybe not on that day. There have been instances where they have called after a week, and that's that thing which you did, and lo and behold, I won't even remember I did that hand. But because it is a very spontaneous process for all the artists, the poetry is not set for us. Although we have the primary text, but the poem grows during the rehearsal. Many a times what we do in the rehearsal, we don't even do on stage. What we do on stage, we don't do it here. So there are people who come back, even artists who say that what we did, we don't even remember. And that process can never leave you lonely.
Right.
Because there are meanings and metaphors and signals given by artists and the audience which make the process and the travel so colorful. Something which is so intangible. Maybe in the process of making it tangible, it gets lonely. Let me go back to it, and it's not there. Then I say, okay, I'll find it again.
Yeah.
And
So
then we pick up another
start
text.
all over again.
Start
Yeah,
all over
yeah.
again.
Yeah. Apurva, recently I was talking about, the whole premise of rigor and the possibility, the way Indian classical arts is constructed is even though there is a framework, there is so much room for innovation, right? I want to ask you a little bit about, your relationship with sadhana, because we didn't get to hear your response, but also the whole idea of response. Like when you work with a poem and you make it your own and you want to share it, because after all you're a performing artist and you want to share it with a larger audience, how do you know that the way you have communicated it has actually struck a chord with the audience? Like how do you gauge response?
So there are two levels of response, right? I think you always start with your own response to that poem or that piece of work that you're picking up. And I think it's interesting for me because the response, I think, has to start one with, like in Tamil we say rasanai. You have to, be a rasika of that work. There should be something in that work that triggers you for you to be able to take that into a space of dance. But what's interesting for me is I think what those triggers are and what is capable of triggering that for me has greatly evolved with time, with my training in dance. Right. Because I think, as a child, a song that I would have heard or a poem that I would have found very powerful, today I would not perhaps engage with that through dance. And vice versa. It was also very interesting for me. I was having a conversation with a student very recently, where she said to me, there are these padams that you do in dance which are so, there's such a great resonance of meaning and so much beauty when you dance it. But she said, when I read it, it sounds very ordinary. Yeah. And I have been in that space and I understand the truth of that perspective, but I think what my journey in dance has made me see is that you have to read that poem through dance, using dance as the tool to read it, right? And so it's almost like, today when I hear that statement, it's a dichotomy to me in the sense that
you have been through that arc as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that's kind of also what happens. Gauging response, of course, in terms of how you understand how your audience has responded to it, I think, there are multiple ways, but what we're constantly striving to do is, I think, create that experience, create a certain feeling like in the first session as we saw, and I think it was very rightly said that you didn't hear the words. You heard the experiences of these women that was being written about, right? And I think that's what you strive to do. That's the effort. And I think, like Purva said, in terms of the responses, it's an evolving thing. Every piece evolves with time. Every time you perform it, you find the nature of the responses that you receive from the audience is also evolving. Yeah.
Navya, I want to ask you a little bit about, this whole idea of response itself, really more from the perspective of, have you ever been in a situation where, you felt the need, like, the classical arts constantly comes under the pressure of being, sometimes it's labeled as inaccessible, right? So how do you feel the need, in some sense, to make the work that you create accessible? Is it okay if people leave the room without really understanding everything that you've said? Because it's, there is so much which is the intangible, right? So how do you sort of negotiate that? Or is it sometimes, you talked about the silences and the pauses and the intangible. So I want you to elaborate a little bit about this whole pressure that classical arts are perhaps grappling with, about the need to be accessible, right?
Yes, I have come across this, and I also have my friends who are not from the dance fraternity, who have nothing to do with the arts.
Which is also crucial,
Which
right?
is crucial. I was just going to say that. You need them as your bouncing boards.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones who actually show you the mirror and say, Navya, this isn't working for us, right? And I think as classical dancers, we have a responsibility. It is not about just coming on stage and telling the world what we believe in. Yes, there is conviction at the end of the day, but how am I going to get them into that space? So, and there's also, I think the audience is also, sorry if I offend anybody here, but I think it's always good for them also to read up a bit about the classical arts, but it's the responsibility of the artist to invite them into that, because if I'm going to do a piece from the epic, if I take a character from the epic, how am I going to make that character relevant for today's world? In fact, he or she remains relevant for the rest of their, for the rest of our lives, because if you look at the epics like Mahabharata or Ramayana, you find characters who have different shades. They have shades of, they're black, they're white, they have shades of gray. And we see that even now in ourselves. So what I do is I say, okay, for example, I think at Natikala conference, which was done 2 years back, curated by Rama Vaidyanathan, she said, she selected 4 artists, and she said, think about a question, ask a question through your dance. That was the only briefing we had. And then I was thinking, what question do I want to ask through my art? And of course, I had a friend with whom I bounced off the idea, and she said, Navya, how about the character Mandodari from Ramayana, a lesser known character? And I thought about it, and I said, she's been through a lot of battles just being Ravana's wife. What were the whirlpool of conflicting emotions that she may have experienced? And I said, okay, let me look into it. So when I brought that on stage, I used a mirror as a prop where she's reflecting. She says, am I strong? Am I weak? Am I going to wither away? Or am I a flower that's about to blossom? And then I flipped the mirror to the audience to ask, what is your perception on it? Because we are, at the drop of the hat, we're ready to judge people. We don't know the battles behind them. So at that point, some of them came forward and they said, we totally got it. We could relate to that, the kind of struggle she's been through. And some of them couldn't, because there was a lukewarm response. And some of them said, you can't be tampering with a character from the epics. But I wasn't tampering. I was trying to, because she means something to me, and there is relevance in today's world.
Right.
You can't just put them on the back burner and say, well, sorry, they're not accessible. No, I think the artist has to invest in it, given energy, time, and blood, sweat, and tears to make that and to showcase that, not as a performance, but as, it's voicing your feelings. So I think it is up to the artist to also bring that relevance. And of course, I would urge the audience to at least have a smattering of it. Because at the end of the day, we all are growing. So why not through art?
No, absolutely, and meet midway, right?
Yes.
Yeah. That brings me to my next question, Purva, really about the importance of questioning, right? And also the importance of investing, like she rightly said. And also, like, how do you make it your own, right? If you could probably just share maybe an example of one of the works where you've, questioned the poetry, and you have actually engaged with it, invested time, and actually really brought your imagination and your interpretation to the poem, really making it your own in a sense?
When I was under Swapna Akka, she had this process of asking the student what padam you want to learn instead of giving the padams to a student. So being a student of sociology as well, I wanted to understand what a grahasthan faces, because we have many padams talking about how Devadasi feels. And I was really bored about these padams saying, you cheated me, I'm tired of you, get lost from here, telltale marks. I didn't want to do that. So this is the padam she gave. The first line when I heard it, I said, I can't do it, I don't want to do it. The first line says, Adadani, Janmamu ettina phalamemi ati varo vyarthamamma. Adadani, woman. Janmamu ettimi, what is the use of having this birth? Ati varo, oh lady, it's vyartham, it's waste. I said, why am I doing this in this age and stage? And talking about feminism, student of gender studies. Then the Anupallavi says, Medalu meddalu mendu kalikina nemi, Edaina vibhunito kudi undakapote. What's the point of having these big, big palatial houses and this space and this opulence and affluence when I can't even sit with somebody who really cares for me, who really connects to me, my space, my inner space? And I was really in tears that day. And this padam has grown over me, with me. And there's so many women in the audience who said this is something we really resonate with even today. And it's not about being only a married woman. It's about anybody who wants companionship. And the Charanam goes on to say, what's the point of being so beautiful? What's the point of having so much jewelry? What's the point of doing Pati Bhakti all the time when he's not even here to look at what all I've worn? Even if I'm flashing my sari in front of him, he's not even seeing it. So, for that, you believe me, Akka took us to this cupboard where she had kept different saris. I don't know why is she doing that. Each sari she took out and taught me how to wear it differently. The texture of it, the view of it, and what all a woman will go through when she has this collection of saris, she keeps on looking at them and wears them and looks at herself in the mirror. Nobody to appreciate. Now we can judge her and say, apne liye jiyo, kya farak padta hai, koi dekhe na dekhe. But that's not the character here. So I had to let go of my judgment and get into her skin. And then I did relate to her. I even went through such instances in my life. And then, of course, there's a postscript to it. We can write another padam saying, Jane do, main kuch bhi pehnungi jo mera man hai. That's a different thing. That's like journey of a character. But this is a padam which has stayed with me. And I'm so thankful to my teacher for giving that perspective, that point of view. Even a Devadasi can feel this, for that matter, because she had these lovers who had a family. And they came, so every time they come to this woman who's madly in love with him and doesn't have the label of being a wife, every time he may not appreciate her. She can feel that ekam in her. So this poem has really
Thank you for
taken
that.
me into a world of...
Yeah, but speaking of padams, thanks for that, Purva. Speaking of padams, Apurva, you mentioned your relationship with padams has evolved. But I also want to hear both your thoughts on, Apurva, you also teach. So you also, work with young, women and men who are engaging with these padams, who are probably questioning it. And so do you allow them time for these, just like you, like how your trajectory was really about this process of evolution? And how do you kind of speak to an audience which is very, very contemporary and which probably finds some of this content a little archaic and perhaps not in line with, the way we live our lives now? So I just want to understand how your relationship with padams in general and how you actually teach them to young students.
Yeah. I think it's very interesting, the example that Purva brought up as well. And, the fact that she mentioned that a lot of the content that we present through what in the last few centuries we have as a certain body of literature for dance is from the point of view or from the lives or stories or voices of Devadasis. What's very interesting, there are two things that are very interesting for me here. One is to people who say that this content is archaic, I would say stop. think twice. And like Navya said, you have to give it time, right? We're quick to judge, but sometimes you have to allow, not necessarily 10 years for it to grow on you, but just give it a chance. Because I think the beauty of dance literature is the fact that these are stories that are drawn from everyday lives of women, women who were at that point of time perhaps the empowered women of society. I know, I'll probably receive flag for saying this, but nevertheless, but it was about taking these stories from the specific and making them resonate with you and me. And over time, every single padam, I don't think you have to, the first padam may not convince you as a student of dance,
course,
right? You need to do 10, you need to do 30, you need to do 50 for you to find your own conviction within it. What is interesting to me that perhaps today, the reason why as artists we're faced with questions, like Navya was giving the example of Mandodari and an interpretation or a take, is that I think today, unfortunately, what we have lost is developing poetry alongside dance. So in a sense, poetry that is being written to be danced,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
And I think we don't have that anymore. Similar to, what the example Navya gave, I recently worked on a piece on, again, a character from the Ramayana, Ahalya. And this is actually a complete imagined scenario. It is not even a situation that happens in life. It was a short story written by a Tamil author, Pudumai Pittan, where he questioned Rama's dharma, Rama's idea of dharma, and what he implemented or lived by as dharma through his life, through the eyes of Ahalya, who was in fact delivered by Rama, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And so she looked at him as an epitome of dharma in a sense.
Savior.
But much later in her life, and this is, of course, this is not in the Ramayana, and this is, was his imagination. What would she have said when she heard of the situation of Sita's fire ordeal?
Absolutely.
Right? And this is a reimagination where she says, I can't make sense of this dharma that morphs from, one moment to another, or that is different, when it comes to your wife versus another woman, or is different when it comes at a different point in your own journey in life.
Absolutely.
And she voluntarily returns, back to stone. But this was in the form of a short story. So when I did perform it, the poem, the idea developed first, right? The questions developed first, and the poem was written for the dance. And that's how the poem developed as well. And I think the more we do that, the more we allow that to thrive, more stories of you and me that we feel may be missing or not represented are automatically going to find their way
You're making
into
the
the
point in
repertoire.
the absolutely right forum, so I hope the poets here are going to be listening. Navya, your take on this, and then we have a video, so...
I'm sorry, I was so absorbed in her conversation that I forgot. Could
Well,
you
I was
rem-
just asking you about your relationship with Padams.
Yes.
Because Purva brought it up and talked a bit about it.
Yes. So the thing is, so when you're growing in India, you're growing in a very secure environment. You've heard of these tales, you've heard of Puranas, you've heard of Upanishads, and there's a kind of an understanding of it. So when I left India and went to the US, now of course I'm back, but when I was in the US, it gave me a very different perspective on my art. It actually helped, because when I performed there were these questions as to, okay, why is this woman behaving a particular way? Why are you portraying a woman a particular way? And then I understood that I was so comfortable in my zone that I would delineate her the way I did. And then I started thinking, and I realized that it's about making it relevant to them. I'm going back to my same point, because I don't think, as exactly how Apurva said, relationships and emotions are universal. They don't change. A struggle of a woman or a man then is perhaps the same struggle now, and if you don't work towards it, we're perhaps going to have the same struggle ahead. So what happened was I came up with this, there is Amuru Shatakam. It's actually written by, legend has it that Adi Shankaracharya got into the body of Amuru, King Amuru, when he was questioned on celibacy. And I took the 69th poem. So this is written in the 7th and 8th century, yeah? And it says, I'll just give you the translation of it, where she says, there's just 4 lines, open-ended. She says, initially, you and I were inseparable. Later, you became a lover, and I, your miserable beloved. Then, You became a husband and I a wife. What is left to say? The fruit of this relationship that I have received is that of a hard heart. Now, I have no metaphors there to help me. And I found that very interesting. I said, let me draw a narrative around the 69th poem. It resonated at some level with me. And so then I brought in the metaphor of poem and melody, where I said the togetherness was expressed through her writing poem and he was setting the melody for it. In the second half, where she says, I became a miserable beloved, is when he leaves her for some business purpose. And she starts to write the poem, but she's unable to set the music because she misses him dearly.
Right.
And then the last, where she says, now you're married, she goes ahead and gives him the poem, but meets with indifference from his end. And then I had a student of mine sit there. I'm coming to the point is, I had a student of mine sit there and she said, Auntie, what's the ending? So initially what I did was, I went with the poem, I read it as a hard heart, and I said how I withdraw myself, I turn bitter. You know, and I just tear the poem and I throw it off. And then she looked at me and she said, but this isn't empowering. And then bang came the thought. I said, yes, I can show the same woman, but what is it that is changing? Hard heart doesn't mean that you're getting bitter. Probably you're turning rock solid.
Yeah.
Where you write I ended it up like this. I wrote my own poem and I said, I can set my own melody. I don't need the outside to inform the inside. I'm happy where I am. And that resonated with her. And then I realized it's the same. My mom speaks about, my aunt speaks about it, my niece speaks about it. So padams have their relevance. Again, I would go back to the point about how do you want to interpret them? Of course, keeping in mind the intent of the poet. You don't stray from that because you're taking that poem for a purpose. But stick to it and try and see if you can make it very relevant for yourself and for the world around. Yeah.
That's lovely. Thanks, Navya. I'm just going to ask, do we have time? Oh, okay. That's right. So maybe we will just, I just thought it would be a bit unfair if we have a panel of dancers and not watch them dance. So we just put together a little
Yeah.
video, but Apurva,
Sorry,
you want to make a point?
I just want to take a minute to, because I thought I'll talk about the song that is in the video. And it's very interesting how both now, examples that Navya and Purva have spoken about, they resonate very well. So this is a poem from Tamil Sangam literature.
Okay.
And I've been delving a little bit in that in the last few years. And it actually is a conversation between a mother and a son, and in fact, her toddler son. And Sangam poem works with these ideas of nested metaphors. And it only talks about her observing her son playing with a toy elephant, and he tries to break down this huge, object, of course, with no success. But he finds these little girls making sandcastles, and he immediately sees that he has this easy target to allow this, toy elephant to sort of do its job. And that's all it says. She then has a conversation with the child where she says that, be like your father in all his good qualities, but let me tell you in what qualities not to imbibe from him. So she sees in this whole thing that's playing out with her child, this very beautiful, it doesn't state that the husband is unfaithful or indifferent. There is no statement of it. But there is this beautiful undercurrent of actually not being visible in the relationship, not being seen, right? And after a point, being taken for granted. And I mean, every single relationship, I think, goes through this phase. I just wanted to.
Yeah, thank you so much. Can the team just play the video, please? It's a 7-minute video, so.
என் போர் யானை வந்திகைக்கு என் போர் யானை வந்திகைக்கு என் போர் யானை வந்திகைக்கு என் போர் யானை வந்திகைக்கு ஆந்த தேரை வாய்க்கிங் கிணியார்ப்ப மாந்ததேவாய் கிங்கிணியார்ப்ப இயலும் என் போர் யானை வந்திகைங்க பொலம் பூனை செம்பாகம் போர் கொண்ட இமைப்ப 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 கடிகரணம் பாயானின் கை புனை வேழம் கடிகரணம் பாயானின் கை புனை வேழம் பொலம் பூனை செம்பாகம் போர் கொண்ட இமைப்ப கடிகரணம் பாயானின் கை புனை வேழம் பொலம் பூனை செம்பாகம் போர் கொண்ட இமைப்ப கடிகரணம் பாயானின் கை புனை வேழம்
where the blooms of memory grow. I was nurtured by your kindness and the concern you did show. As my branches reached for the sun, did I forget my roots? Confronting my guilt, I set my grief free. I celebrate your love and set my love free, so that you can come back to me.
मनसि मधुर शीले मयि मिलित वात्सल्य ललित लीले ऐकिमिच्छसि मनसि मधुर शीले मयि मिलित वात्सल्य ललित लीले कमालिंगनं दलित दुरितं एकमालोकनं भाव भरितं
मंजुतर कुंजतल केरी सदने मंजुतर कुंजतल केरी सदने इह विलास प्रतिरभास हसित वदने इह विलास प्रतिरभास हसित वदने मुरारे हरि प्रविश राधे 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 प्रविश राधे
Thank you so much. Basically by Nietzsche again. And it says, and those who were seen dancing were thought to be insane by those who could not hear the music. Thank you so much. Thank you, Apurva, Navya and Purva.
What an outstanding privilege it was to be just seeing this session. Really, thank you so much. In the Natya Shastra, they say that at some point, there is no separation of the audience and the performers. What was so lovely is just not that was achieved. What you took us through was also interpretation, the art form, the physicality, the performance. You took us through so many layers. And actually, it was just a discussion. So I have no words to describe what this experience was. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.